Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer fantasy lore, where today we're going to have a look at the shattered lands of Nagarythe, and the defiant shadow warriors who still call it home. Although, perhaps home is too strong a word. Once upon a time, before the Sundering, Nagarythe was the greatest of all the elven kingdoms, and the court of the first Phoenix Kings. It was a resplendent realm of tall, slender towers and bustling markets. Despite Nagarythe being the scene for some of the fiercest fighting against the demonic hordes of the Great War, Nagarythe had emerged from that conflict stronger than ever. And whilst the ruler of Nagarythe, the great Ellyrion, the first Phoenix King, had given his life to defeat the demonic hordes, none doubted that his firstborn son Malekith would be both a worthy successor to his father and the natural heir to his title of Phoenix King. Which reminds me, I haven't actually done a video on Malekith yet, have I? The Witch King himself. I probably should get around to that at some point, presumably before the end of the world, because he turned out to not be quite the shiny paragon son that Ellyrion and indeed the entirety of elf-kind was hoping for. But the tale of Malekith, he who was to become the Witch King, and indeed the tale of the Sundering itself, those are topics for another video. For now, all you need to know is that when the Council of Princes decided that it would not be Malekith, but instead a high elf noble from Tiranoc named Belshazzar, who was to succeed the title of Phoenix King, Malekith did not take that particularly well. Not particularly well at all. But you can hardly blame the Council of Princes over much. They wanted peace, understandable after the Great War, and Elyrion's firstborn son? Well, Malekith was many things, but a man of peace he was most certainly not. Something he was going to prove in rather dramatic fashion. After returning northwards to Nagarythe, he hatched a plot, together with his mother Morathi, to overthrow Belshazzar and crown himself the rightful Phoenix King. And as a tool in this process, he used his persecution of the so-called Cult of Pleasure. Essentially, he accused anyone he didn't like, mostly his political opponents, surprise surprise, of being members of this heretical, vile, chaos-inspired Slaaneshi cult. Whilst in reality, the cult had been founded by his mother, more or less specifically for this purpose. And with Malekith in command of the army, and possessing all of the prestige he had inherited from his father, along with a seemingly justifiable cause belli for his witch hunt, very few, if any, dared question him. Until he accused Belshazzar himself of being a chaos cultist. Malekith then arranged a trial for him, which turned out to be an exceedingly expedient affair, executed him, and voila! The path to the Phoenix Crown was open. All that was left now was for Malekith to march triumphantly through the sacred flames of Ellyrion and be officially recognized as the Phoenix King. But unfortunately for Malekith, and god damn I hate this fucking plot point, the elven gods were mischievous little bastards and decided to burn him to a crisp, which unsurprisingly sent him fleeing from the flames in pain and surprise, as he was supposed to merely pass straight through them, like his father had. In the old, and may I say, correct fluff, the gods burned Malekith because he had dabbled far too much with dark sorcery to be healthy, and so they rejected him, whilst in the fluff of that series, which shall not be named, they were merely playing a prank on him, not expecting him to be so much of a pussy as to pull out halfway. But that whole disgraceful sham is fortunately besides the point of this video. After being turned into an over-easy chicken McNugget, Malekith fled back to Nagarythe, with the aid of his still faithful servants, and of course Nagarythe, who nursed him back to health. She encased him in a burning suit of living dark metal, which literally seared itself onto his skin. You know that whole Darth Vader thing? How it seems to be a bad idea to encase a severe burn victim in heavy leathers? Well, this is that, except one step beyond. You know, the Warhammer way. But despite what must have been crippling pain, copious quantities of it, Malekith was not down for the count. And whilst his little ploy had now been thoroughly revealed, he was not about to give up his claim to the throne just yet, and so he initiated Plan B. For the Cult of Pleasure was not merely a cause belli for Malekith to go crazy on his witch hunt, it had also been a gathering ground for those sympathetic to a bit more of an extreme approach, shall we say. And it had also armed itself to a considerable degree. The lands of Nagarythe had always been faithful, mostly, to the line of Ellyrion, and it had been fertile ground for the Cult of Pleasure. Which meant that in turn, whilst Malekith had lost control of a great deal of the army he once commanded, them starting to ask questions now, why Malekith had murdered their previous king, and then been rejected by the flames, he did have plentiful replacements standing by, and as of yet, many of the elven kingdoms were not quite sure what had happened. Did the Council of Princes really betray Malekith and attack him because they themselves were involved in the Cult of Pleasure? Or was it Malekith that had betrayed the princes and de facto murdered the Phoenix King? This confusion gave Malekith time to prepare to recuperate briefly and then strike, initiating the elven civil war known as the Sundering. And his first target, of course, was to secure full control over Nagarythe. And most of that greatest of kingdoms' noble lords had already declared for Malekith. Indeed, most of them had already been heavily involved with the Cult of Pleasure, but some did stand against him. Some did remain loyal to the true Phoenix King, Calidor I, who had been so recently elevated. And thusly, Nagarythe became the very first battleground in the Elven Civil War, and the first truly major clash of arms between the two new sides happened at the Battle of Dark Fenn, where the Loyalist forces under the command of Eothlir Anar stood against Malekith's new Dark Elves. Unfortunately for Eothlir, was his honourable ancient house had chosen to stand against Malekith, most had chosen the opposite, and he found himself outnumbered 3-1. Long odds, even at the best of times, but due to that overconfidence and nascent arrogance, the Dark Elves, desperate to bring Eothlir to battle, had allowed him to choose the site of the engagement. And Eothlir's noble house had existed in these parts for centuries. He was very well acquainted with the terrain, and expertly chose the site of the first major battle of the Elven Civil War. As the name implies, the Battle of Dark Fenn was fought over a particularly marshy piece of terrain. The Dark Elves had to march in serried ranks against Eothlir's positions, where hundreds of them were claimed by the black-fletchered arrows that would become so very feared amongst the Dark Elves in centuries to come. And even when the Dark Elves finally made it across the swamp and into contact with the Loyalists, they were exhausted, demoralized, and unorganized by their long, treacherous slog across the bog. In sharp contrast to this, the High Elves still stood in well-ordered ranks of spearmen on the other side, and the initial clash of the two forces seemed as if it was slowly but surely beginning to favour the High Elves. They withstood the first frenzied assault of their new, darker cousins, and if things had been allowed to continue like that, maybe, just maybe, the High Elves could have pushed the Dark Elves back into the swamp and slaughtered them, or at the very least, denied the Dark Elves an early victory. But unfortunately for Ellyrion, the Dark Elves had an ace up their sleeve. A brand new weapon that had never before been seen in Ulthuan, although it was hauntingly familiar. As the banner of Ellyrion stood proud across the battlefield, seeming to signal a near-inevitable victory for the Loyalists, and potentially the premature end of this budding revolution, a great dark shade appeared in the sky and blotted out the sun. Mere moments thereafter, both the proud banner, Ellyrion himself, and most of his household guard were crushed and savaged between the bulk of the very first black dragon to blight the lands of Ulthuan. In one fell swoop, the command structure of the Loyalist armies had been torn apart, and now facing ever-mounting numbers of Dark Elves managing to fight their way out of the bogs and onto the solid footing, they began pushing the High Elves back. And with a rampaging black dragon in the heart of their formations, the High Elves quickly began flagging, faltering, and then fleeing. Eothlir's last words to what remained of his household guard and his son alongside them was a command shouted through blood-flecked lips to run. And seeing no other option, Alithanar ran, bringing with him those of his kinfolk he could, rescuing as many as possible from the Dark Elves' pursuit. And now, the Loyalist High Elves would get their first taste of just how much their Dark cousins hated them. The Dark Elves continued the pursuit of the scattered remnants of the Loyalist armies for weeks. And all of this through the scattered fens, bogs, and marshes of Nagarythe's most inhospitable terrain. It requires a certain kind of hate boner to continue a pursuit for that long in such uncomfortable surroundings. The spirit of the High Elves were flagging badly. Only a few survived, and out of those few, an even more unfortunate handful chose to try their luck with their cousins. For surely, surrendering to them couldn't be that bad, right? Oh, how naive those poor High Elves were back then. But eventually, after weeks of pursuit, the Dark Elves gave up, either simply assuming that whatever was left was hardly worth chasing down, or figuring that they'd gotten all that they were likely to get, and leave the rest of the work to the swamps, the bogs, and the marshes. When Alithanar and his handful of survivors emerged from hiding, they found their ancestral homelands pillaged, raped, and burned, their kith and kin either butchered where they stood, or dragged off, like Alithanar's grandfather, to the new dark towers of Nagarythe to be tortured for their secrets. The survivors were stunned. They had not expected this. True, their cousins had appeared changed even on the battlefield, and that fell dark beast that descended upon them was no ancient dragon. But this was the kind of abuse they may have expected from the hordes of chaos, but from their very own countrymen, it was beyond imagining. And were it not for the leadership of Alithanar, the handful of survivors then and there may have simply given in to despair, and wandered off into the wilderness to live simple solitary lives until they were hunted down or killed, or simply took their own lives, wishing to no longer live in such a world without friends or family any longer. But Alithanar gave them an alternative. He offered them a focus, a far more constructive and direct focus, that would be taken up by many on the shattered isles of Ulthuan, both during and after the Sundering. Hate. and no flame of hatred burns quite so brightly as that of vengeance. Unified beneath this new banner, Alith Anar and his survivors ventured out into the shattered ruins of what had once been their home, in search of survivors, in search of other elves that they may share their flame with. And once sufficiently reorganized, they began their dark work. First, they struck out against any targets that presented themselves. There was little thought of an overall strategy in those early days, just bind the Dark Elves and make them pay as much as possible. But as the war progressed, it was made clear that Malekith was not going to have it all his own way. The rallying loyalist forces, now united under the rule of Caledor I, began fighting back, and more of the noble houses and princes of the realm began siding against Malekith. No matter what his reputation may once have been, and no matter who his father was, his new, much darker nature was becoming apparent to one and all. And this gave Alith Anar and his people newfound hope that a victory may yet be wrestled in the long term from the defeat at Dark Fenn, and their sporadic raids became more targeted, more organized, and more focused on the overall war effort. No longer were they merely ambushing roving bands of Dark Elves, or striking out at whatever targets they could find. They began targeting things of strategic value: supply caravans, messengers, forward bases, scouting parties, and so on. They were nibbling away at the fringes of Malekith's army, forcing him to strike out at ghostly figures that faded away into nothingness the moment after they had struck, which in turn yet again forced Malekith to dispatch yet further forces to the rear, to act as security forces against ever bolder and ever mounting raids. And soon, Alith Anar began making his presence felt on the battlefield as well. During the second battle of the Ellyrion plains, the Dark Elves had brought to bear a new invention: the Reaper Bolt Thrower. This was a weapon with a far higher rate of fire than the traditional High Elf bolt throwers, and its battlefield debut was as dreadful as it was effective, with each murderous machine able to launch several volleys of half a dozen brutally barbed arrows into the High Elf lines every minute. Its unprecedented rate of fire was causing absolute bloody havoc in the High Elf lines. And the Reaper Bolt Thrower was also able to fire a single, much larger projectile, meaning that even if the High Elves were so inclined, merely striking the Reaper Bolt Thrower batteries with dragons or other flyers was not a wise move either. And as Malekith's forces began their advance, pushing deeper and deeper into the ragged holes torn through the High Elf formations by the Reaper Bolt Throwers, it seemed as if the second battle of the Ellyrion plains would be a terrible defeat for the High Elf forces, perhaps even the defeat to end the war once and for all in Malekith's favour. But as it began to appear as if nothing could be done against the Witch King's new wonder weapons, the weight of firepower began to dwindle. Fewer and fewer barbed bolts were falling upon the High Elf's positions, and as Malekith no doubt looked back to discern what was the problem with his new weapons, he saw Alith Anar and his warriors emerge from hiding and strike out against the Reaper Bolt Thrower's crews, making quick work of them, surprised and under-armoured as they were. This sudden intervention tipped the scales of the battle, and allowed the High Elves to avoid a terrible defeat. It is even said that after the battle, Caledor the Conqueror, the Phoenix King himself, sought out and thanked Alith Anar in person for his part in the battle. And this would be but one of many instances where the still loyal elves of Nagarythe struck out against their traitorous cousins, until eventually, with more and more of the High Elf nobles turning against him, Malekith was forced to flee back to his strongholds in Nagarythe. At this point, with victory seemingly on the horizon, the still loyal elves of Nagarythe gathered in the badly damaged and burned groves beneath the Dragon Pass. There, they swore eternal loyalty to Ellyrion, his house, and his bloodline. They had waged a long war from the shadows, striking out against their dark cousins, and extracting a terrible toll of pain and suffering upon them to begin to equal that which they themselves had suffered. Even the loyal elves had garnered themselves quite the dark reputation during these later years of the war. They had come to call themselves the Shadow Warriors, and Ellyrion then became their Shadow King. Whether this was meant to be a temporary title until they regained their homeland, or if it was to be carried as an eternal mark of both shame and triumph, is unclear, because the lands of Nagarythe were never truly and fully reclaimed by the loyal High Elves. On the verge of defeat, Malekith decided that if he could not have Ulthuan, then no one else should have it either. Entering into a dark, demonic compact with the force of chaos, Malekith began a vast ritual designed to bring the demons back into the world of the living, at the very heart of Ulthuan. The High Elves did what they could to stop this, warned by one of Malekith's own sorcerers who saw the plan for the apocalyptic madness that it was, but the High Elves did not have the strength to stop Malekith and his covens of sorcerers. But as Malekith's plan was set to bear fruition, it was countered by the still bound mages on the Isle of the Dead, forever entrenched against the force of chaos in an effort to keep the great vortex running, siphoning off the chaotic energies throughout the world. The great archmages could spare but the merest moment, the slightest hint of effort from their everlasting ritual to bolster the efforts of the High Elves to defeat Malekith's ploy. But luckily for the whole world, it was just enough. And so instead of seeing the entirety of Ulthuan overrun and annihilated by demonic hordes, it was instead merely ravaged by titanic earthquakes that leveled cities, and a tidal wave said to be 1,000 foot high, which submerged vast areas of northern Ulthuan. Malekith, and much of his court, his most favoured sorcerers and disciples, were able to escape the destruction of northern Ulthuan by using further great and mighty sorceries, to rip their fortresses from the very soil of Nagarythe and turn them into mighty floating castles that would later become known as the Black Arks. But as for the rest of Nagarythe, what had not been torn away by the sorceries of the Dark Elves and had not been subsumed beneath the waves of the ritual, it was a little more than a blasted hellscape, scoured by waves and magic to the point where no good creature could ever live there anymore. But as far as the Shadow Warriors were concerned, this did not change anything. They were still looking for their revenge. There were still Dark Elves alive, and as long as there were still Dark Elves, their revenge remained incomplete. Whilst most of Ulthuan, currently in the midst of a catastrophe, was more than happy to simply write off the blasted remnants of Nagarythe and the handful of scattered Dark Elves forces that still remained within it, the High Elves, after all, had considerably greater concerns to deal with right now. The Shadow Warriors moved back into their ancestral lands and began the Purge. All Dark Elves would be hunted down, tortured, and inevitably, grudgingly, be allowed to die. And the Shadow Warriors had learned well the lessons that their dark cousins had taught them when it came to the value of pain and suffering. They were no novices when it came to ensuring that death, however inevitable it may be, would take its time about things. After one battle, where the Shadow Warriors managed to capture a full 700 Dark Elves, a mighty catch indeed, considering the Dark Elves were well aware at that point what fate awaited them should they be captured alive, the Shadow Warriors nailed every last one of them up on the high, white cliff walls above the battlefield, making sure to take their excruciating time with each and every one, allowing his comrades to truly appreciate what was in store for them as well. Even to this very day, the bones of those most unfortunate Dark Elves can still be found resting at the bottom of the cliffs after their bodies long since rotted away and broke free from the iron nails who once fastened them to the white cliff walls, now pitted and scar with the red-tinged rust of those very same nails. It is perhaps not entirely surprising that the rest of High Elf society view the Shadow Warriors with a measure of suspicion, if not indeed open hostility. The High Elves know of the valor of the Shadow Warriors, and whilst none would go so far as to question their loyalty, many would perhaps question their actions and their seeming need to really hammer home the point, if you will excuse the pun. And considering that the Shadow Warriors have more than earned their dark reputation, again, it is not much of a wonder. But even after clearing out every last trace of the Dark Elves from Ulthuan, or at least all those who remained after the Witch King had headed north, that was still not enough for the Shadow Warriors. And, with Alith Anar, their Shadow King leading them, large numbers of Shadow Warriors set sail for the northern continents of the New World, where it was rumoured that the Dark Elves were still in existence. The High Nobles of Ulthuan eventually convinced themselves that there was no way the Dark Elves could ever become a true threat ever again. Surely, the cold, dark and inhospitable lands of the far north would eventually finish them, for they could not possibly gain any true sustenance from that arid landscape. But of course, the Shadow Warriors knew better. After having travelled across the seas themselves, they engaged in a lengthy and extensive guerrilla campaign against the Dark Elves, frustrating their efforts to settle into their newfound lands, striking at them, their raiding caravans and supply convoys, making life as difficult for them as they possibly could. But, as hard as they tried, they could not truly dislodge them. They did not have enough support from back home, and the Dark Elves, ever paranoid, had built plentiful fortifications should their high-born cousins ever have a true go at them again. Eventually, Alith Anar disappeared. None truly know what fate befell him. Some say he is still alive, wandering the wilds of Nagarythe or Nagarythe, ever in search of further cousins to punish for their trespasses. And indeed, his descendants, the Esnir, still believe that he is somewhere out there, and will return to them when they truly need him. And so none have ever taken up the title of Shadow King again, though the Shadow Warriors, they are still plentiful. They keep their distance from the rest of High Elf society, knowing both how the rest of the High Elves see them, and perhaps also preferring to keep to themselves. It is difficult to imagine that a people as scarred and abused as the Shadow Warriors would ever be truly comfortable in more civilized surroundings, and their constant, nagging need to enact vengeance upon their dark cousins to fulfill their oaths drives them ever more. Most of the Shadow Warriors these days roam the lands of Ulthuan, in the shattered remains of Nagarythe in particular, hunting down Dark Elves, raiders, and slavers which ever blight those dark shores, and on occasion they will set sail for the northern continents as well, in an effort to make sure that their dark cousins can never quite forget about those they once betrayed. Their preferred tactics rely heavily on stealth, as their name so obviously implies. The Shadow Warriors are few in numbers. Not able to really establish themselves, they still live a mostly nomadic life. Not exactly the kind of lifestyle that leads to large, stable, familial groups. And so each Shadow Warrior needs to make sure that his arrows count. Their preferred weapon, of course, being a slight variant upon the High Elf longbow. A hint less powerful, but a great deal lighter, and the most striking feature is their ammunition. They are said to utilize lighter arrows, carved from the withered trees of Nagarythe, tipped with barbed arrowheads, and then covered in tiny, subtle thorns along the length of the arrow shaft, just to add a touch more suffering for the poor bastard who tries to pull the arrow out of him. As for how much truth there is in these sayings, well, whilst I imagine it would be difficult to craft arrows from a withered tree, if anyone could do it, it probably would be the High Elves. And as for the barbed tips and arrows, oh, I can imagine. Oh, I can absolutely imagine that part, certainly. And once they have engaged the enemy with a withering hail of precise arrow fire, the Shadow Warriors will burst forth from concealment and engage the remnants of the enemy in a flurry of blade slashes, aiming to cut them down and neutralize the enemy before they have a chance to react. And hopefully, take one or two alive as well, for the sake of afternoon amusements. And whilst the Shadow Warriors do not respond to calls for aid, or directly ally themselves with any of the other elven kingdoms, they do tend to show up when most needed. It's just that they are the sole arbiters of when and where they are most needed. But whilst the limited numbers of the Shadow Warriors certainly mean that there is many an engagement in which they will never play a part, it must on occasion feel as if the Shadow Warriors are everywhere and nowhere all at once, because they are one of very few forces in the Warhammer world that can make even the Dark Elves afraid. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.